Before we begin, take a breath. This isn't just a podcast, it's a new way to think, speak, and live in English. Welcome to Coffluent Podcast, where words flow, confidence grows, and every sip brings you closer to fluency.
I love that. And today we have a really fascinating deep dive lined up for you.
We really do. So I want you to imagine, like, walking into a middle school classroom.
Okay.
The kids are just throwing desks, setting fire to the trash cans, scribbling all over the
A
walls.
total, absolute chaos.
Exactly. And meanwhile, the substitute teacher is quietly sitting at the front of the room, totally ignoring the chaos and just stuffing the school's budget into their own briefcase.
That is a pretty wild visual.
Right. Now imagine that classroom isn't just a school. It's the entire global geopolitical landscape.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Today we are taking a really fascinating and, frankly, quite provocative look at the state of the world, but through a very ancient lens.
We're unpacking a recent interview with the author and Vedic scholar Acharya Sridharma Pravartaka Acharya, and we're mainly focusing on his recent book.
Right. The book is called Interregnum, Restoring Authentic Rulership in the Kali Yuga. And our mission today is really to decode his incredibly unique framework for understanding all this modern political chaos.
Yeah, and then to explore the deeply practical, like on-the-ground advice he has for individuals trying to navigate all this uncertainty.
Before we get into the weeds, we definitely need to establish some ground rules for today's deep dive.
We absolutely do. Right out of the gate, we want to be clear that we are exploring this specific author's religious, cultural, and political viewpoints.
Right. We are not endorsing or, validating or taking sides on any of his claims.
Exactly. Whether he's discussing global conflicts or specific world leaders or traditional social roles, our goal is simply to map out the framework he uses to view the modern world.
We just want to give you the blueprint of his arguments so that you can critically examine these ideas for yourself.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this blueprint, and we really have to start with the title of the book itself because it really sets the absolute foundation for his entire worldview.
It really does.
The word is interregnum. It actually comes from two Latin words, regnum, meaning of the king or the ruler, and inter, meaning in between.
So literally translated, it means in between rulers.
Right.
And it's a historical term that's usually applied to a gap in a royal lineage. Like a king dies, the heir isn't quite ready, and there's this chaotic transition period where nobody truly holds the crown.
Yeah, but the author is applying this concept to the present day, like on a massive global scale.
Which brings us back to your substitute teacher analogy from earlier.
Yeah, because technically there is an adult in the room,
Yeah.
right? Like technically someone is sitting at the big desk.
But functionally, there is a massive power vacuum.
Exactly. The students know the person at the front of the room doesn't have any real underlying authority to actually lead them.
And that is exactly how the author describes our current geopolitical landscape. He claims we are currently living in a global interregnum.
Like a period where, sure, we have presidents and prime ministers and chancellors on paper, but we don't actually have legitimate rulers.
And the key word there is legitimate. We really need to define how he's using that word.
Because it's not the normal definition.
Not at all. In his Vedic framework, legitimacy has absolutely nothing to do with, like, winning an election or holding a constitutional office or even having a massive military.
Right.
A legitimate ruler is someone who rules virtuously, strictly on behalf of the people's well-being, and in accordance with what he would call universal or natural law.
He refers to this as dharmic rulership, right?
Yes. Ruling with a transcendent sense of duty and righteousness. And his core, highly controversial thesis is that the vast majority of our current global leaders completely lack this virtue.
So, therefore, they are fundamentally illegitimate.
Exactly.
So he's saying the global stage isn't just filled with leaders who are, occasionally making bad policy decisions.
Right.
He's saying the stage is filled with people who have zero moral right to be there in the first place. I mean, the interviewer in the source material even called it an empire of thieves.
It is a really bold claim, essentially saying that basically everyone in charge is just a substitute teacher looting the school budget.
It's a massive, sweeping claim. But it is worth noting that he doesn't think literally every single leader on Earth is illegitimate.
No, he doesn't. He does carve out a few specific exceptions to this rule.
Right. He points to a handful of people who he thinks are actually doing the job.
Yes. From his perspective, there are a few leaders currently operating who actually do meet his criteria for authentic dharmic rulership.
Okay, who does he name?
For example, he specifically names Narendra Modi in India, praising him as a leader ruling genuinely for the people and in accordance with higher cultural laws.
Oh, okay.
He also explicitly points to Viktor Orban in Hungary as another example of a leader he believes operates without corruption and directly on behalf of his nation's best interests.
Gotcha. But again, just to reiterate, analyzing this strictly through his specific philosophical lens, he sees these figures as incredibly rare exceptions.
Very rare. He sees them as beacons of actual leadership operating amidst this massive sea of otherwise illegitimate, self-serving politicians.
So, okay, if we follow his logic, we have a global landscape where the overwhelming majority of leaders from the highest levels of federal government all the way down to local city councils, are fundamentally self-serving.
Right.
The obvious question that jumps to my mind is, well, how on earth did we get here?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Like, how did the entire globe seemingly lose its legitimate leadership all at once?
Well, answering that requires us to look at the broader theological timeline he uses.
Okay, let's hear it.
In ancient Vedic cosmology, time doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in massive cyclical ages.
Ah, right, cycles.
And the current age we're living in is called the Kali Yuga. It's characterized essentially as an era of profound spiritual decline.
Like an age where true virtue is inherently scarce.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, the author doesn't just blame a mystical time cycle. He points to a very specific human mechanism that caused this.
Which is?
He argues that over the last several hundred years, human society has systematically removed God, spirituality, and transcendent ideals from the absolute center of its institutions.
Oh, I see. It's kind of like trying to navigate a ship across the ocean, but you've intentionally removed the magnetic north from the compass.
That's a perfect analogy.
Suddenly, north is just wherever the captain feels like pointing the ship that day. It becomes entirely relative to whoever currently has their hands on the steering wheel.
Exactly. And he points to the public education system as the prime historical example of this compass losing its true north.
How so?
Well, historically, education almost everywhere in the world had a deeply religious or spiritual component running parallel to mathematics and science.
Right, you were explicitly taught how to be a moral person, how to conceptualize a higher power, not just how to be a smart person.
But over the centuries, those institutions became radically secularized.
Yeah, he points out that in places like America, it became functionally illegal to even pray in a public school setting.
Precisely. And according to his framework, when you systematically remove a transcendent moral ideal from public life, education, and politics, you aren't left with a neutral, objective utopia.
No, you are left with pure amoral relativism.
Right. If politicians are no longer culturally expected to serve a higher divine purpose, their focus naturally shrinks to their own base needs.
Like greed, wealth, fame, and self-preservation.
Exactly. And this creates what he calls a total moral inversion.
Wait, moral inversion. So it's not just that things get a little corrupt.
No, it's that the entire value system flips upside down. He talks about how lies are suddenly promoted instead of truth, and how the unnatural is elevated over the natural.
Wow. And he frames this moral inversion by contrasting two paths of human behavior, right? Described in the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes, the ancient Hindu scripture. First, there is the Daivika path. Think of this as the godly, virtuous way of living acting in accordance with that natural compass we just talked about.
Okay, so that's the Daivika path.
And then there is the Asurika path. He describes this as the demonic or sociopathic path.
Okay, so totally self-centered.
Exactly. It is the mindset of doing whatever it takes to succeed, ruthlessly exploiting others, and prioritizing personal gain without a single second thought.
Let me make sure I'm getting this right. He isn't just saying that modern secular institutions passively ignore the Daivika or virtuous path.
Right.
He is arguing that a totally secularized system actually actively incentivizes the Asurika path.
Precisely. Think about it. If there's no higher law to answer to, and no cultural expectation of transcendent virtue, what is the mechanism to stop a corrupt politician from taxing the public just to put money in their own pockets or the pockets of their friends?
I mean, there isn't one. The sociopathic behavior is actually rewarded with more power in that system.
Exactly.
But, let me push back on this timeline for a second.
Go for it.
Because if this secularization process has been happening for hundreds of years, if we've been systematically removing these spiritual compasses from our institutions for centuries, as he claims, Why does he feel like the crisis is suddenly hitting a boiling point right now?
It's a great question.
If it's been a slow burn since, like, the 1700s, why are the alarms blaring so incredibly loudly today?
That is really the pivotal question, and it transitions us perfectly into his predictions for our immediate future.
Okay.
He acknowledges that the root cause, this spiritual decline, has been a slow generational process. However, the symptoms are now compounding.
Compounding, like it's speeding up.
Yeah, it's no longer a linear decline. It has become a hockey stick curve of chaos.
Ah, because the people operating on that Asurica sociopathic path have essentially run out of runway.
Yeah.
Like they've looted everything there is to loot.
Yes, exactly. And this is where we have to connect the why to the what. When he points to massive global crises like the devastating wars in Ukraine and Gaza, crippling global inflation, broken supply chains, he isn't looking at them as random, unfortunate accidents.
He sees them as the direct mathematical result of an empire of thieves looting the system.
Right. Because our leaders are driven purely by short-term greed rather than a transcendent duty to their nations, they make highly volatile, self-serving economic and diplomatic decisions.
So the inflation and the conflicts are just the natural byproduct of that illegitimacy.
Exactly. And he also points to what he perceives as severe cultural degeneracy being pushed onto young children right alongside the geopolitical tensions.
Right, like rumors of conflict between China and Taiwan, North Korea aggressively testing missiles.
Things that just a decade ago would have seemed like paranoid fiction are now just standard daily headlines.
Which leads to his highly specific and honestly very bold prediction regarding the year 2024.
Yes. Because of this exponential acceleration of crises, he views 2024 as a unique crucible.
A crucible?
Yeah, an era of unprecedented chaos, the likes of which most people alive have never experienced. He suggests we should brace for potential economic crashes, severe geopolitical conflicts, and even domestic riots in major Western cities.
Wow. He is essentially predicting that we are entering the absolute explosive peak of the Interregnum's instability.
He is.
Okay, but this is where I experienced a massive amount of psychological whiplash when I was reviewing the source material.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say.
Right. Because on one hand, he's warning of this dire, almost apocalyptic short-term reality. The kind of warning where you start wondering if you need to stockpile extra food and water in the basement.
Yeah, totally.
But in the exact same breath, he calls this impending chaos the darkness before the light. He predicts that within a year or so, the entire world is going to experience a total, miraculous turnaround.
It is a truly striking juxtaposition. Amidst all this predicted devastation, he genuinely foresees a sudden, beautiful transition into a golden age of global peace and unprecedented prosperity.
That is just wild.
It is. And a key component of this prediction is the total collapse of modern, secular institutions that he believes are currently enslaving humanity.
Right. In the interview, he explicitly targets the World Economic Forum, naming it as one of the primary entities destined to completely collapse and lose all relevance in the very near future.
But you're right, it's a lot to take in.
Yeah. How is the average listener supposed to reconcile that massive pivot? Like, hey, the global economy might crash, supply chains might break, and there might be riots in the streets. But don't worry, a global utopia is right around the corner.
It's a lot.
That is an overwhelming amount of cognitive dissonance for a person to process. The natural human reaction to that kind of forecast is just to freeze up in absolute panic.
And that biological reality is exactly why he shifts his focus away from macro geopolitics and drills down into micropsychology.
Okay, so he addresses the panic.
Yes. He understands that the natural reaction to an interregnum is profound fear. But he offers a very specific, practical antidote to help the individual cope without succumbing to that paralysis.
And the very first step of that antidote is something we could probably all benefit from right now, which is turn off your television.
Radically limit your news consumption. He advises checking the headlines for maybe 5 minutes a day just so you aren't completely ignorant of the world and then stepping away entirely.
Because the media isn't like a mere objectively reflecting reality. It's a behavioral modification machine designed to monetize your panic.
Exactly. They are businesses.
Right. If they keep you agitated, angry, and terrified, they keep you watching. And they generate more ad revenue.
It's a cycle. You have to cut off the artificial fear machine, but you can't just leave a void, right? You have to replace that external noise with internal practice.
And he emphasizes the concept of sadhana.
Yeah.
For those unfamiliar with the term, what does sadhana actually look like in practice?
Sadhana translates roughly to a dedicated daily spiritual practice. Instead of marinating your brain in anxiety-inducing news headlines, he advises taking time every single day to sit in absolute silence.
Like putting the phone in another room. No screens, no podcasts, no distractions.
Exactly. The goal is to consciously take refuge in the divine, whatever your specific religious background might be.
Okay.
By doing this daily, you intentionally absorb and reflect higher qualities: peace, truth, wisdom, and beauty. You actively bathe your mind in goodness rather than chaos.
It really comes down to where you anchor your attention. If you anchor your attention in the chaotic interregnum of the world, you will be terrified because it's completely out of your control.
Right. The substitute teacher is ruining the classroom, and you can't stop them.
Exactly. But if you anchor your attention in something eternal, you find an immovable stability.
And to explain this mechanism, he uses the word surrender, which I think is a term that gets fundamentally misunderstood in modern Western culture.
Oh, very easily misunderstood. Usually when we hear the word surrender, we picture a military defeat.
Like waving a white flag, giving up your agency, submitting to an enemy.
Right, but the author defines it in a completely different paradigm. He argues that spiritual surrender is not giving up your power. It's a positive, active choice to give yourself fully to a higher purpose.
It's an act of profound trust.
Yeah, you remain in full possession of your intellect and your faculties, but you choose to align your personal will with something infinitely greater than yourself.
And he draws a direct line between this act of surrender and the total eradication of fear.
Wait, really? The total eradication of fear?
Yes, and this is perhaps one of his most profound psychological insights. He explores the deep connection between fear and isolation.
Okay, how are those connected?
Well, he argues that the ultimate human terror isn't actually physical pain or even death. It is the fear of being entirely alone in a cold, hostile, meaningless universe.
Oh, wow. That's heavy.
It is. He points out that even in modern maximum security prisons, the absolute worst punishment we can inflict on a human being is solitary confinement. It literally breaks the mind.
So how does surrender fix that primal terror?
When you surrender to God, when you genuinely trust in that higher power through your sadhana, you cure that primal aloneness.
Because you realize you aren't alone.
Exactly. You realize you were never actually isolated because the divine is always present with you as your greatest friend and protector. Therefore, the very root of your fear is eradicated.
That makes a lot of sense.
And he actually references chapter 18, verse 66 of the Bhagavad Gita, highlighting the concept of the Abhaya Mudra.
And what's a mudra?
A mudra is a symbolic physical hand gesture in Eastern traditions, and the Abhaya Mudra translates literally to do not fear.
Do not fear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When the divine essentially orders you not to fear, he argues, you have the ultimate transcendent permission to completely let go of your worldly anxieties.
Now, if surrendering to a higher power cures that internal primal fear, it completely changes how you operate externally, right?
Absolutely. You aren't paralyzed anymore.
Which explains why his next step isn't just to, retreat to a mountaintop and passively watch the world burn.
Right.
Once you conquer your internal fear, he says you actually have a sacred duty to step up as a micro-leader. He shifts the burden of fixing the world away from these corrupt politicians and drops it squarely onto the shoulders of everyday individuals.
It's a fascinating pivot from the metaphysical to the highly practical. In an era of interregnum where top-down leadership has completely failed us, leadership must be rebuilt from the bottom up.
Yeah.
And for him, the absolute foundational unit of that societal rebuilding project is the family.
Yes, and he is very open and entirely unapologetic about the fact that he approaches this as a self-described radical traditionalist.
Which is a bold stance.
Very bold.
Oh.
He argues very strongly that men must step up to be the undisputed leaders of their households. He claims this is a natural, biological, and spiritual order that has successfully sustained human civilization for thousands of years.
Right.
In his view, the modern societal experiment of abandoning these traditional structures over the last few generations has only led to broken families, confused children, and widespread misery.
Which is, of course, a highly polarizing stance in our modern secular society.
Oh, without a doubt.
But if we look past the immediate political charge of traditional gender roles, the underlying psychological argument he's making about leadership is quite compelling.
Oh, so?
He's talking about the absolute necessity of teaching by example and the destructive nature of modern escapism. He gives a very vivid example of a father who spends 5 or 6 hours a day playing video games or indulging in vices like drinking alcohol or smoking.
Right. He says a guy like that cannot possibly be a true leader because children don't listen to what you say, they copy what you do.
Exactly.
If you're acting like a selfish child yourself, avoiding hard things and escaping into a digital world, you are just a male, biologically speaking. But you aren't acting as a true man or a father.
Because you are failing to provide a physical model of virtue for your kids to emulate.
And this is where his argument gets really interesting, because he views this transition into authentic fatherhood not as a loss of personal freedom, which is exactly how modern culture often frames it.
Yeah, we have this pervasive trope of the ball and chain.
Right, the idea that once you have kids, your fun life ends and you were just trapped.
But he rejects that entirely. He sees fatherhood as a necessary, sacred sacrifice. Taking on that immense, heavy responsibility for a child's entire well-being forces a man to mature.
It strips away the selfish video game playing tendencies.
Exactly, because you suddenly realize a precious, innocent life depends entirely on your competence and your virtue.
Actually, the interviewer in the source chimed in here with a great personal anecdote.
Oh, right.
He admitted that until he had kids, he felt like he was just playing at life. He said he literally felt like a kid for 50 years until he became a father, because the presence of his children acted like a blindingly bright light, shining on all his own weaknesses, his selfishness, and his bad habit.
It forced him to actually grow up?
Yeah. And furthermore, the author argues this deep sacrificial bond of family is the ultimate cure for the crushing loneliness of modern life.
Think about it. We have the internet, we have social media, we are more technologically connected than any humans in history, yet people report feeling more isolated and depressed than ever before.
Right.
His argument is that heavy, unavoidable responsibility, the kind you have for your spouse and your children, is the only true pathway to meaning, fulfillment, and deep connection.
You surrender your selfish, short-term desires to the well-being of your family, and in return, you gain an unbreakable bond and a profound sense of purpose.
It is an incredibly heavy responsibility, but it's also deeply empowering.
It really is. So, if we synthesize everything we've talked about today, the author is painting a picture of a world caught in a profound interregnum.
Right.
We are living in a gap between true virtuous rulers, where our macro institutions have been hijacked by corrupt politicians, functioning basically as sociopathic substitute teachers.
And because of this macro-level failure, which he attributes to a centuries-long secularization and a tragic loss of our spiritual compass, he believes we are currently facing a period of intense, accelerated chaos.
But the way out isn't to panic.
No, definitely not.
The way out isn't to buy into the fear or to obsessively track the latest geopolitical disaster on your phone.
The way out is to turn off the TV,
Mhm.
to build spiritual resilience through a daily practice of silence.
Right. To surrender your anxiety to a higher power, and then to take radical, uncompromising personal responsibility as a leader in your own home and your own community.
You build the fortress of society back up, brick by brick, and you start with your own family.
Exactly. And whether or not you align with his specific Vedic religious framework, his predictions of a utopian turnaround in 2024, or his radical traditionalist views on family structures, the underlying utility of his core message is just undeniable.
I agree. In a world that is technologically optimized to distract you and make you anxious, reclaiming your attention from the 24/7 news cycle and reinvesting that energy into your immediate surroundings, your family, and your own personal integrity is a profoundly effective strategy for living a good life.
It completely reframes where your power actually lies.
It really does.
Which brings me to a final thought for you to chew on today. We spend so much of our time, our intellect, and our emotional energy agonizing over the interregnums in national or global politics.
Yeah, we yell at the TV about the substitute teachers running the world.
Complaining about how they've lost control of the classroom and how they are ruining the economy. But to what extent is our obsession with all that distant global chaos just a really convenient excuse?
Ooh, that's a good point.
Is it possible we fixate on the massive leadership vacuums in the world just so we don't have to face the substitute teacher currently running our own personal lives?
A difficult but incredibly necessary question to ask ourselves.
Something to think about next time you catch yourself doom scrolling. Till next time, take care.